Good Tuesday in the first week of Ordinary Time. Okay, this is going to be really a consistent thing at St. Mark's Gospel today. This is kind of the common narrative of the church. It goes on for 34 or so weeks with the Easter, the Lent and Easter in between. But this is the ordinary time of the church. So it's the ordinary teaching of the church. It doesn't mean boring, it's ordinary as opposed to specifically, for instance, Christmas and Easter, which are specific times in their preparation and their celebration. This is the ordinary teaching of the church through the scriptures, okay? And I'll read it to you. Okay, it's from Mark, and it's the first chapter of Mark. And Mark is the most fun. He's the earliest of the Gospels. And in fact, the way I understand it, Matthew and Luke are based on Mark's Gospel. So I'm not a scripture scholar, but Mark comes first. Yeah, Mark comes first. Anyway, Jesus came to Capernaum with his followers, and on the Sabbath he entered the synagogue and taught. The people were astonished at his teaching, for he taught them as one having authority and not as the scribes. In their synagogue was a man with an unclean spirit, and he cried out, "What have you to do with us, Jesus of Nazareth? Have you come to destroy us? I know who you are, the Holy One of God." Jesus rebuked him and said, "Quiet, get out of him, come out of him." The unclean spirit convulsed him. A loud cry came out of him. All were amazed and asked one another, "What is this?" A new teaching with authority. That's the key line here, by the way. He commands even the unclean spirits, and they obey him. His fame spread throughout the region of Galilee. The key line in this text, you would think it'd be the exorcism of the evil spirit, but it's that he's taught with authority. He teaches with authority. In the rabbinic tradition, you don't teach with personal authority. You always depend upon your antecedents, the authority of the rabbis that went before you or the Pharisees that went, the tradition. You appeal to the past for the right to say what you're saying. So you would say, as Rabbi somebody said, or as the Pharisee said. Here, he's not saying, as my predecessor saying, as the Pharisees or as the prophet said. He's saying, I say to you. That's really crucial, and they're picking this up. And you think of St. Mark now. St. Mark is writing to Jewish Romans, or Roman Jews, and he's saying Christ is the authority. You don't need any other. You don't need the Old Testament or the Old Prophets, or you start with Christ and then read the Old Testament. And see, that is, in a sense, the truth. If you're a Christian, you start with who and what is Christ. Then you read the Old Testament. You read the prophets in the light of Christ, not Christ in the light of the prophets. You want to understand Isaiah, the suffering servant of Isaiah, you start with Good Friday, and then you read Isaiah. But it's not, oh, look at Isaiah predicted it. Whether he did or he didn't is irrelevant. He probably was writing about the suffering of the Jews, but it makes no difference. From a Christian point of view, one starts with Christ and then reads the entire Old Testament, starting with Genesis, in the light of the faith we have in who and what is Christ, that he is the incarnate Son of God. And he redeemed us through his passion and death. You start with that, and then you read the entire story that goes before it. So we don't read the Old Testament as a Jew would read it. We read it as a Christian reads it. Start with Christ, then look at it. And if you want an antecedent to that, listen to this. My clocks are chiming, all right? But let me show you. If you want to read the Old Testament as a Jew reads it, and I believe I'm right on this, you start with Exodus. And in the light of Exodus and the law that Moses gets, now you read everything going before it. That's extremely important. So we're only following, in a sense, the practice of the Jews. You start with the primordial event. And in that sense, the primordial authority, who is Moses, who gives the Jews the law on Sinai, okay? And you read the entire, everything that goes before that is preparatory of that. But you don't know that until you start with Sinai. See? You start with Moses and Sinai and the law, and then you look backwards at the whole story of the evolution of divine revelation from the beginning of time. See, it all exists before. But the way you know it is before is because you start with what's after, namely, what's after is the story of the Exodus, okay? For the Christian, that Exodus experience is Good Friday and Easter Sunday. And in the light of Good Friday and Easter Sunday, one goes back and reads, for instance, reads the lilies protecting me from assault from without. You read the Christmas story in the light of in the light of Good Friday, not the other way around. So you want to understand the Christmas story, you have to understand it in the light of the passion and death of Christ and his resurrection. You see, I didn't do a good job. Lil's distracting me, but this is the truth. As what the Jew begins with Exodus and the law given by Moses on Sinai, the Christian begins with Good Friday and Easter Sunday, and then reads everything else, including the birth account. Yeah, the birth account. You see, it makes it interesting as Mary is given us, and especially in Luke, okay, and the angels, even there it's predicted that he will suffer. He will suffer. And where is Mary in the Gospel of John, which is the last great gospel, written long years later, almost to the end of the first century? Where is she? She's standing at the foot of the cross with John. So it begins, in a sense, with Luke, and especially with Luke, and the story of the Nativity. You want to understand the Nativity, you have to read John and read the account of Mary, the new Eve, standing at the foot of the cross before the new Adam, Christ. You want to understand Adam and Eve, you got to see the new Adam and the new Eve, Christ, the new Adam, Eve, Mary, the new Eve. You see, it's how you do it. The Gospels and the biblical writings are not history lessons. They are theological reflections on what we already believe. They are the great story, the great narrative of our faith. We begin with the faith. We don't read the Old Testament and the New Testament to prove our faith, but only to explicate what we already believe. It's, an analogy could be, you know who you are in your family. When you hear stories about your grandparents and great-grandparents, it's not to prove who you are. You already know who you are, but to understand who you are. You start with who you are and then look backwards and understand it accordingly. We look to the Old Testament, the great stories of the Old Testament, but we look at them as understandable in the light of the New, and especially the account of the passion, death, and resurrection of Christ, the new Exodus. So if you want to understand the Exodus of Moses, the full meaning of it, you have to understand is the Exodus of Christ on Good Friday and the emancipation and the freedom. Now, not from the Egyptians or the enslavement of Egypt, but the enslavement of sin. You see? I know it's how it works, you see. But that's typical of all great ancient writings. You start with the present, interpret the past in the light of the present, and especially in Revelation. You don't understand Genesis unless you first start with Exodus. See, it was written in the light of Exodus, the story of Adam and Eve and redemption, see, including Abraham. We begin not with Christmas, but with Good Friday and Easter Sunday, and then we look at Christmas, but not the other way around.